Tonight, you guys are in for a bit of a treat. 9 stories, all containing one of 2 main themes, if not both. Scary stories involving the outdoors and or the creatures that lurk in it. From night drives, to home invasions, to camping and hiking. Making this video reminded me just how unsafe anywhere and everywhere can be, and I hope that you'll take some knowledge from it as well, because some of these stories are allegedly true. To not ruin the immersion, I will let you decide which ones you want to believe and which ones you don't. Tonight we are also joined by my good friend Swamp Dweller. He will be reading stories 2, 4, and 6. If you aren't already aware of who he is, I suggest checking out his channel once you're done here. He makes videos on all sorts of different topics on a very regular basis. He also has some really cool documentaries on all sorts of different creatures of the night that I bet you'll enjoy. A huge thank you to the writers for allowing us to share their stories. Please remember to drop a like if you enjoy, as it helps out the channel in a real way. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Smoke and the aroma of spilled beer and whiskey billowed out of the doors of the locals' favorite bar as cowboys and girls herded out after closing time. A young woman with blonde hair and high-waisted skin-tight black denim jeans kissed her girlfriends goodbye before breaking away to walk to her car alone. The neon light that covered the parking lot shut off and engulfed the area in darkness. One by one, headlights began to flick on, and country music filled the air. She lit her cigarettes and smoked leisurely while she kicked the dirt beneath her on the way to her car. The smoke was stale, probably expired, but it went well with the cool Texas night air and partnered just right with the buzz she was losing. Peggy had the pedal to the floor, going at least 95 with her left wrist dangling over the steering wheel in her candy red 1969 Pontiac GTO. She had her eyes fixated on her purse, fumbling through the crap that filled the bag. Chewing gum, pens and notebooks, work ID, driver's license. A blaring honk came up from the road. Peggy shot her eyes up and saw a pair of headlights coming at her from the same lane. Her lane. The wrong lane. She swerved the steering wheel back clockwise, and the car jerked itself back onto the right side of the road. She chuckled and shook her head and went back into her bag. She flung the aforementioned stuff onto her floor and continued rifling through her bag. This time, every once in a while she shot a quick glance up at the road to make sure she was in between the lines. Where are my smokes? She thought to herself. She usually didn't smoke, but it had been one hell of a week, and she wanted to blow off some steam tonight. She and her girlfriends met up at Donnie's Burgers and Fries for some greasy food and milkshakes, and then hit the swinging door, one of their favorite honky-tonk bars to dance, and attempt to pull some tail. She was going home solo this night though. It wasn't the best night at the door. A lot of married guys and creeps. Enough of them came up to the girls that night, but Peggy wasn't having anything they were trying to offer her. The night was not a bust though. She did get to dance with her best friends, and she managed to score a pretty good buzz on the creep's dime. She eventually found the white and red labeled case, and opened it with her right thumb and index finger. The last cigarette, the sweetest to inhale, and the most bittersweet to smoke. She grinned regardless of the number of smoke it was. She popped the stick into her mouth and switched off hands onto the wheel. She cranked the window lever and let the rapid breeze fill the car. Her long blonde hair whipped back and forth against the cold morning wind. She reached into the left side of her jeans and wiggled out her lucky lighter. A brass windproof lighter. She gripped the lighter tight in her hand and slid her thumb up to pop the top open. She gave the wheel a couple of flicks before she secured a flame and brought it up to her lips and lit the tobacco. The drag hit just right. She double-checked to make sure she was the only car on the country road before she closed her eyes and let the breeze wash over her face. She turned up the volume on the radio and let her arm dangle outside of the car, tapping the door to the beat of the song. About 10 miles from her home with her parents, Peggy glanced down at the gas meter. It was fast approaching E. She reflected on the time and how much she did not want to stop, but it seemed like she did not have much of a choice. She loved her goats, but it drank gas like a fish swallows water. She shut off her air conditioning just to squeeze as much mileage out of the tank as she could. She spotted a gas and go. Its neon green sign of a tall pine tree shined like the North Star in the starless blackness. That was the Houston sky. She pulled down her turn lever and fired on her left turn signal. When she did this, she was alerted by a matching light in the reflection of her rearview mirror. Oh, she had not been alone on the road as she had thought. Well, it's been a while since I checked anyway, she laughed and thought to herself. She turned into the fueling station and pulled her car up to pump number 4, her favorite number. She shut off the ignition and filled the car with silence, only echoing her humming on the song that was on the radio. Perpendicular to her Pontiac was the trailing car, a black El Camino, that took its spot at number 5. She knew it was a coincidence, but she could not shake the peculiarities of the driver choosing that pump. The driver's side of the coupe swung open, and a tall, handsome gentleman made his way out of the car. He rounded his car, dragging his knuckles across the slick hood, and approached Peggy's rolled-up window, and tapped his index finger on her window. He was good-looking, but not that good-looking, Peggy reminded herself. She playfully shook her head and wagged her finger back and forth at the man, laughing playfully. He squished his hands together to imitating a praying gesture. Peggy flashed him a smile, and he shot one right back. It was beautiful. He had the darkest green eyes that she had ever seen, and a row of teeth that a dentist would use as an advertisement. She played along and cracked her window just enough to be friendly. "Good evening, pretty lady." The handsome stranger tipped his hat. "What can I help you with, darling?" She feigned flirtatiously back. "You hungry? Got an all-night diner right on down the road. Would love to treat the prettiest woman I've seen tonight, a short stack, and a nice cold glass of orange juice." "Well, ain't that tempting?" She grinned. "I don't know, though. I ain't the going home with strangers type." "Who's saying anything about going home? Just come and get some chow with me. Promise to be on my church behavior." Peggy ran through her plan in her head. She had led this guy on long enough, and there was only so much that she felt comfortable harmlessly flirting could help the situation. "Alright, stranger." She paused. "What's your name, cowboy?" "Cowboy Bob." He took off his hat and wiggled his hand through the crack in the window to shake her hand. He had a business card in between his index and middle finger. She took the card, winked, and put it in the breast pocket of her denim shirt, and reciprocated the handshake. "Is that short for Cowboy Robert?" His hand lingered inside of the car, gripping the edge of the lowered window. "No, ma'am. That's my father." He winked. "Alright, Cowboy Bob. You seem like a gentleman, right? Can't be a cowboy and not a gentleman. This ain't no time for a beautiful young lady like myself to be standing outside and pumping my own gas, right? Can't say I disagree. How about you run inside and get me a couple of bucks on this here pump number 4, and give my goat a little fuel, so I can make it to the diner and accompany the best looking man I've seen tonight to a short stack and a cold glass of orange juice." Cowboy Bob laughed and adjusted his belt buckle. "Come on now, honey. Why don't you just leave this beauty right here and come on in with me?" Peggy shifted in her seat uncomfortably. She did not want this creep to see how uneasy she was. She knew that's what he wanted. "I don't think so, Bob." "Oh, come on, honey. Don't be like that." He shifted his eyes from hers down to her fuel monitor. "Come on, baby doll. Why don't we just take a walk? We can get to that diner from here." She knew if she could just get him to go inside, she could just drive off and find another station. "I can't leave the goat." She kept her eye contact with the man and fingered through her purse, feeling around for her cash. "Here." She brought forth a single $5 bill. He held up his opposite hand, palm facing her, and declined the woman's cash. "Well, the problem is..." He took a deep breath in and thought about his next words. "I just don't think you are going to be here for me when I get back. And I'm going to feel pretty silly coming out here to pump gas into an invisible car." "Well, cowboy?" She took the extra couple of seconds to think her words as well. "If I did run, and how could I run out on such a stud as yourself?" She winked. "If I did cut it, well, you got $5 worth of gas to pump into that beauty you're riding in right there." She motioned to his black Camino, chrome shining in the lights of the bulbs overhead. "Now listen, ma'am. I don't need any damn gas." He placed his other hand on the window, and nonchalantly tried to push it down further. "I ain't the begging type. All I want to do is take a fine young lady such as yourself out for some pancakes and orange juice. Hell, I'll even throw some eggs and bacon on the table, if that will sweeten the deal." "Well, then why the hell are you at a gas station at 3 in the morning?" She fired back. "No, honey, that's..." He paused. "Listen, baby doll. I just left the bars. Maybe my words ain't as good as they could have been." Cowboy Bob looked a little frazzled and gripped the window more intensely. She could see the wheels inside of his head turning, looking for a better excuse. He wrinkled his nose, but was able to force out a toothy smile. "Sorry, sugar. Don't mean to scare you. I'm just looking to grab some cigarettes." Peggy leaned back and rifled through her purse looking for her carton of cigarettes. "If he takes this, when his hands are out of my car, I can take off." She finally came across the carton on the floorboard. He was going to feel that it was empty. "Maybe I can drop it," she thought. "I just know dancing all night makes a girl work up an appetite. Just wanted to do the gentlemanly thing and buy a sweet girl a nice plate of flapjacks. How do you know I was out dancing?" She broke. "Have you been following me?" She kicked on the ignition. Bob leaped his arm in the car and grabbed the wheel, locking it in place. "No, wait. He spit out. "Wait, please." Peggy threw the gear shift to drive and slammed on the acceleration. Bob locked his fingers around the wheel and had his feet thrown from the ground. She spun the wheel with her right hand and clawed and slammed Bob's hand. His body jerked and flung with the car as she twisted around the filling station. He yelped and cried, swore and shouted, but Peggy couldn't make out anything he was screaming. And finally, with one last sharp left in front of the storefront, and a final body slam against the GTO, he fell to the concrete. She threw the steering wheel to the road and spun out. "Fuck," she thought. Tears streamed down her face. She kept her foot to the floorboard and did not look back. Her victory was soon interrupted by the flashing of her fuel indicator. She knew that she couldn't make it home and lost all sense of safety and victory, thinking about having to stop again and try to get gas. She let off the gas a little bit, bringing the ride to a more conservative speed. A neon statue of Earth eclipsed the full moon in the distance. Global gas. She turned in and waited in the silence of the night. Nothing. She sized out the distance between her and the storefront. About 50 feet. She inhaled and exhaled. She wished she had not smoked that last cigarette. She hopped out of her car and slammed the door. She sprinted like she never had before. When she got to it, she yanked the door, but it was locked. She pulled again and stumbled backwards. With her face pressed against the glass, she peered inside and scanned the store. There was a man behind the counter standing asleep. She slammed her fist against the glass and pleaded for the man behind the counter to let her in. The man jerked awake, annoyed, angry, and confused by her barrage of hits against the door. He breezily walked to the door. The slower he walked, the more frantic the banging got. Please let me in." She kicked at the door. Finally, he fumbled through his keys and unlocked the door. She nearly knocked him over as she shoved the door open and fell to the cold tile of the filling station store. "I need gas," she coughed out. The man didn't really acknowledge her. In hindsight, he must have assumed she was just drunk. $5 on number 5, please," she said shakily. $5. He motioned towards the counter. She reached in her pocket. Nothing. She turned out her left pocket. Her right. She patted her rear, feeling for anything. Nothing. She reached in her breast pocket that she housed Bob's business card. She looked back at her car. "I'm really sorry. I left my money in the car." She paused. "Would you possibly walk with me out to get it? Please?" The attendant furrowed his eyebrows and squinted his eyes. "Hell no. I ain't falling for that," he shouted. "You trying to rip me off? You trying to rob me or some shit?" She looked back at her car, the only thing that sat in the parking lot that wasn't filled with gasoline. "You at least watch me?" she asked, defeated. The young man nodded. One more tear rolled down her face, and she shook her shoulders, giving her body one last pump up before running. She walked through the store, weaving through the salty snacks and pre-packaged sweet cakes. She bolted out the door and went full speed towards her car. Like a relay runner, she grabbed the $5 bill that she had left dropped on the floorboard in her escape and ran straight back inside. She did not waste time with conversations. She slapped the cash on the counter and ran back to the pump. She squeezed the nozzle and held it with a death grip. Her head was on constant rotation, checking all of her surroundings the entire time she was in the open. She watched the highway road with anticipation, dreading any noise or sign of her headlights. She shot her head back to the pump. She had done it. She stopped early, at $4.72, and shoved the hose back into its holster on the pump. Once again, she peeled out of the gas station and did not look back. She laughed and slapped the dashboard. "Fuck yeah," she shouted. Grinning from ear to ear, she cranked up the radio and reached for her cigarettes. She remembered. She jokingly said aloud, "Might have to turn back for a new pack." She laughed. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the business card. It was a lot flimsier than any card she had seen before. She held it to the light illuminating from the radio. There was just a chicken scratch note scribbled on it. She squinted her eyes and tried her best to adjust her vision to the darkness. "There's a man in your back seat."
Before I start, I should mention that I am half white, half Mexican male, and this story happened to me when I was 17 years old. My family went to California for a summer vacation, and to see the family we have out there. That year, we decided to go camping in a certain park in Northern California for a few days, and being a Phoenix native, it was a much-needed break from the 120-degree heat. All was good for the first few days, until the second to last night there. A group of 5 to 6 of us were sitting by the campfire at 1 in the morning, when we noticed the forest goes dead silent around us. As we all look around at each other, questioningly, we hear the pained, blood-curdling scream of a woman saying, No, ring from the trees to the left of our camp. Not knowing what was wrong or what was going on, we kept our ears open and stayed on guard. A few moments later, we hear the same noise again, but somehow different. More inhuman this time, like a voice being played off of a speaker. We instantly recognized it as the voice of the woman from before. Horrified, we quietly all went to our tents to hide. Eventually, we all fell into a very uneasy sleep. I jolted awake at 3 in the morning, desperately needing to pee. Thankfully, we were across from the outhouses, so after a quick sprint over into the outhouses and relieving myself, I hear what sounded like scratching on a tin metal roof. I immediately froze, remembering the inhuman howl from earlier that night, hoping they weren't related. Armed with only my phone, I watched the next half an hour tick down, either waiting for the sun to rise or for the sound of the scraping to stop. Suddenly, the light in the bathroom cut out. The timer for the lights had gone out, leaving me in the dark. With the faintest bit of light threatening to peek its head over from the horizon, I decided to make my break back to the tent. I made it across the dirt road to the camp when I heard it again. That woman's shriek, but not loud. It had the same intensity and inhuman artificialness, but it was like barely a whisper. Foolishly, I turned around and perched on the metal roof. I saw was a 7-foot, pale gray creature with 3-inch claws on all fours and deep sunken eyes staring at me a mere 25 feet away. Its flesh was tightly stretched across its bones. It was completely hairless and lacked any form of genitalia. I was frozen solid as we looked at each other until it took to its right and saw the light creeping up. It stared at me and let out one more agonizing cry that had me haunted till this very day. It sent one last soul-stabbing stare before it vanished into the early morning. As I lay back into my tent silently sobbing and trying to fall back asleep, I hear the faint echo of the thing's cry. Needless to say, I didn't sleep at all that night and refused to set foot in those woods again. As we left the campsite that day, we saw a homeless-looking woman standing at the side of the road going down the mountain. I didn't make eye contact, but I knew she was staring at me. Once we passed, I casually looked over my shoulder to see if she was there, and she wasn't. But there was an owl who flew close to the ground to where she was.
It happened over 20 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. We were out camping by Fletcher's Pit, and we just finished setting up the tents when it happened. I was down by the pier dipping my toes in the rather cold water, when I noticed my father pacing about strangely. It was like he was searching for something, and he looked really agitated, his face all red and strained. "Dad?" I asked. "What's wrong?" He stared right at me, but it was like he didn't recognize me at all, and all of a sudden his face warped horribly. His eyes nearly popped out of the sockets, and he bit down on his tongue real hard, blood slowly running down his chin. Moments later, he turned around and just ran into the forest. That's the last I saw of him. That's the last anyone saw of him. Some sort of manic episode, the police argued. He snapped, just like that. They completely disregarded the fact that he'd never had any history of mental illness, no past psychotic episodes. They searched the forest and surrounding area for a couple of weeks, but came up empty-handed. It was like he'd disappeared into thin air, no trace of him anywhere. I went up to Fletcher's pit every year after that, always hoping to find something, some clue, but I never found anything. Soon it became a tradition, and some years after that, it became just another camping trip to get away from everyday life. Add a few more years, and I was suddenly a father of my own, dutifully teaching my kid everything I knew about camping. This year we just celebrated Jacob's 15th birthday before we hiked up the trail to the pit. His mom wasn't much of an outdoorsy type, so she'd usually stay home, invite some girlfriends over, and I'd return a few days later finding my wine rack strangely empty. I didn't mind though. We all have our own ways of dealing with life. Some, like her, need to socialize, meet new people, converse, share. Others, like me, need peace and quiet, silence, the great void. Jacob was much like me in that way. He was a quiet kid, a thinker, I guess, and we'd usually just enjoy each other's company without having to share anything. A few words every now and again, a few laughs when the situation called for it. The odd conversation about deeper stuff when absolutely necessary, but more so than not, we'd just sit there in silence and observe. Observe and experience. We didn't say much on the hike up, but as we were setting up the tent, Jacob started asking questions about his grandfather. He'd been told the official story, of course, but I'd never really shared my recollection of the event. I never felt the need, and to be honest, I could no longer trust what I had seen that day. I guess at some point I decided to stop questioning everything, and just accept that the truth would never be known. So, I told him everything. I could tell that it freaked him out just a little, but he tried to act all tough and unaffected, as I explained to him every detail I could remember of that day. When I got to the end, the part where my father's face changed, he let out a little whimper. I don't know, it caught me off guard a little bit. It just wasn't like him. Then he got up and just stood there. "Jacob?" I asked. "What's wrong?" It hit me like a ton of bricks. The shock. Nothing could have prepared me for it. Nothing. He stared right at me, but it was like he didn't recognize me at all. Then all of a sudden his face warped horribly. His eyes nearly popped out of the sockets, and he bit down on his tongue real hard, blood slowly running down his chin. Moments later, he turned around and just ran into the forest. It's strange how fatherhood affects you. When I was a kid, I was too afraid to do anything. I just let my father run into the forest. Even though I loved him just as much, I couldn't force myself to follow him in there. But not this time. This time, I didn't let the terror take control. I ran after him the moment he disappeared behind the trees. He was fast, high school track team fast, but he got those genes from me, so I was able to keep up, just barely, but I never lost sight of him. I swear to this day, I could always see his back. "Jacob!" I shouted. "Come back! Turn around!" He just kept going though, didn't even slow down. The forest was getting thicker and darker, and I could no longer avoid getting whipped brutally by the spindly branches as I brushed past them. It didn't occur to me then how dark it had gotten. It was midday when he took off, but now I could barely see anything but Jacob's white shirt in the distance. The forest grew thicker, unnaturally thick. Soon, I could hardly squeeze myself between the solid trunks, and I yelled and cried hysterically, as my clothes tore and my bare skin chafed against the rough surface. But I could still see him. He slowed down gradually, until he suddenly just stood there, like he was waiting for me to catch up. I frantically struggled through the hellish trees, until I found myself inches away from him. When I reached out to touch him, the ground disappeared below me, and I suddenly found myself tumbling down a steep hill. I don't know for how long, but I do remember vividly the splash as I hit the bottom. It wasn't too deep, knee height maybe. I stumbled to my feet, not realizing yet what I was wading around in, what I had swallowed mouthfuls of. Blood and guts, and the unnameable fluids and body parts that put together in the correct order make up a human being. There were limbs, feet, hands, and heads. Their frozen death expression a horrible insight into the unthinkable depravity that had occurred here. I was too shocked by the gruesome sight to notice him. He grabbed me by the neck and brought my head inches from his mouth before I could even react. But I knew that face. "Dad!" I wailed hysterically. "Let me go!" It was him, no doubt about it. He hadn't aged a day, but he was different in so many other ways. His face was exactly like the insane image I'd kept locked away in the depths of my subconscious. Eye wide, almost popping out, all facial muscles impossibly strained, teeth clenched over a bleeding, black tongue. He had scars all over his naked body, deep dusky scars, going all the way to the bone. His grip on me was deadly, lethal. I could hardly breathe. Slowly he brought me closer to those horrible brown teeth. They were chipped, sharp, jagged, and whatever I did, no matter how much I punched and kicked and struggled, I couldn't get loose. I closed my eyes then, readying myself for death, a horrible and depraved end. "Dad?" Jacob's voice suddenly called. "Dad, are you alright?" I was trembling and crying and aching and hurting. I didn't want to open my eyes. I didn't know what was waiting, but when I felt Jacob's hand on my face, I dared a brief glance. "Dad," he said. "Dad, come on, please say something." I looked around, my gaze darting all over the place erratically. I was on the ground, barely beyond the trees of the campsite. I couldn't even see the lake. Jacob looked flustered, worried, afraid, but he was there, alive and well and unharmed. I couldn't understand. What the hell was going on? Jacob helped me up and aided me as I limped back to the campsite. Nothing made any sense, not even when Jacob told me what had happened. "You got that look on your face," he told me, "like the one you said Grandpa had. Your eyes bulged out, and you looked at me like you didn't recognize me. Then you bit down on your tongue until it almost came off, and just ran into the forest." My tongue had a deep cut in it. I could barely speak, it was so bad. Jacob told me he didn't wait, not like I did. He instantly got to his feet and tackled me just as I breached the tree line. He spent 20 minutes just holding me down, desperately keeping me from going anywhere. Then I just went limp, and slowly came back to him over the course of another 20 minutes. We didn't wait around, just packed up and hustled down the trail post-haste. I don't plan on ever returning. Never again. My wife firmly believes I had some mental breakdown, the same psychosis that took my father. My son doesn't want to talk about it. I don't know what I believe anymore. There's one thing that haunts me, that still doesn't make sense, that makes me question everything. If it was just some psychotic episode, some maniacal outburst, then why were all my clothes in rags, and why did I have open wounds all over my body?
About a year ago, I was on my way home from purchasing some groceries on a quiet, dark night. The way back home was fairly normal and nothing of note really happened. When it was time to unload and move everything to the house, I got this weird feeling that is hard to describe. Now, let me explain the way my street is set up. I live on a cul-de-sac in the suburbs. We also live across the train tracks, so it's usually fairly quiet unless the train is passing through and blaring. Because we only have streetlights on the main road, every other road is left to be engulfed in darkness, unfortunately. As I'm offloading my groceries, my garage door is open and is the only light to be seen amongst the dark housing area. Observing the sky around me, I notice a figure walking up the street. It's merely a silhouette from the darkness, and the contrast of the light denies any fine details to be shown. But, for some reason, I felt fear. Whatever this thing is, it was walking on all fours. The thing has skinny and tall, slender legs. It may be seldom, but not surprising to see animals wandering out, as we do live by the woods as well. But I thought it was weird, as I had never seen an animal like that in this area before. The figure was unsettling to see, being alone in the night and all. Still curious, I saw the silhouette's neck move up, and I could tell it also had turned to look at me. Creeped out even more, I was ready to pack up as quick as possible. But then, the freaking thing starts approaching me. I want to say it ran, but I feel like that might be more of an exaggeration. Regardless, I shut off the light and closed my garage as quickly as possible and headed in for the night. I really did not want to meet whatever that freaking creature was.
There's a town in Jersey's Pine Barrens that's concealed by tall, old trees and surrounded by beautiful, deep lakes. It's enveloped in a serene silence, the only real noise being the flow of wind through the leaves. A thoughtful stillness permeates the surface of the water, allowing it to reflect the oaks and pines above. Night brings an uneasiness that chills pinies, and out-of-towners alike. Some nights you can marvel at the beauty of the stars, something that city dwellers aren't accustomed to, as their lights drive it away. Other nights you find yourself alone in the dark, keenly aware that the birds and the bugs have stopped chirping, and in tune with a very reptilian part of your brain handed down by your ancestors that tells you that something's watching you, and whatever it is, it's hungry. A fear that lives in the sound of twigs breaking in the dark, the stillness of air before it's broken by a pounce, a chilled breath that hangs suspended in each moment between life and death. Part of this is our cultural tapestry. We're taught, from the time that we can understand stories, about what waits in the woods. The Jersey Devil, a hooved, winged beast with the face of a horse and glowing red eyes. The black dog, the white deer, bobcats, black bears. Some boogeymen aren't so far-fetched, but there's one that calls my town home, the man in the lake. In the mid-90s, there was a string of disappearances. Men who went fishing late at night and never returned home. Children and teenagers who went swimming out of eyesight of the beach, where the lake runs deepest, never coming back to their families. After the missing persons reports, some of them were found at the deepest part of the lake, drowned and partially eaten by snapping turtles and the like. There are some fishermen who came back, drenched and cut in one way or another, who warned about something below the surface. 3 tugs on the line, they would say. A fish that was so close to the surface I could grab it, only something grabbed me and tried to drag me back down with it. Something mad. They were written off as drunks, and make no mistake, there were empty cans in their boats, but there was a certain fear in their voice, a certain oddness to the scrapes on their arms. Either way, the town outlawed fishing past sunset and swimming past the beach's pier, and that was that. The deaths didn't just plummet, they ceased altogether, but the strangeness didn't stop, it just evolved. Half-eaten gulls washed ashore, with bite marks bigger than a turtle's or a bobcat's, fishing lines, during the day of course, having their bait picked clean off, or even cut, without so much as a snag. One dumb teenager even took a paddle boat out, and panicked when something hit the underside of his boat. When he brought it back to shore, he saw claw marks. Or it was a rock. But small towns need to move papers too. Anyway, as I used to figure, the man in the lake was the campfire answer to a dark part of our town's past that I think most people wouldn't want to talk about. As most describe him, he's a tall man, 6 feet and some odd inches, wearing sun-bleached fisherman's overalls and torn fishing nets. His beard is made of algae, and when he opens his mouth, sand and mud leak out. Whenever a snapping turtle or mean fish nibbles a finger off, he replaces it with a blue crab's leg, his eyes all gray and wavy, just like a thunderstorm as the rain starts, have an infectious sorrow that infiltrates anyone who has the misfortune to see him. And beyond debate is the fact that he is seized by an almost insatiable hunger. As I said, I used to figure. One night, I found myself staring at a full bag of trash in the kitchen. It stunk, and the last thing I wanted to wake up to was a line of ants redisturbing it throughout the cracks in the walls in the yard. So I bagged it up and took it outside. Some nights, you're aware that you're watched. Something in your brain, that reptilian instinct, receives a signal, but years of living behind walls and in a safe society makes you ignore it. That's why I didn't look over my shoulder after I put the bin out on the curb, and that's why I thought the footsteps I heard were my own. And when I went to scream, I found that my mouth was covered by a glove and felt something sharp against my back. I stared at my own breath, chilled and suspended in the night air, before I felt myself being forcefully walked towards my own home. I felt myself panic, but I was powerless. The only thing I could do was experience the night's air one last time. So I did. I looked up at the stars, glistening beautifully, lifetimes away. I felt the crisp night air on my skin. I smelled the scent of the lake, low tide, strong and off-putting, but unmistakably part of life itself, a life I've grown to appreciate. And as I walked, the knife still poking my back, the scent of the lake grew stronger, full-bodied, fish-like, rotten, and it grew stronger still. I fought back the urge to gag, and just as it smelt strongest, I felt the knife ease up and the noise of someone slipping on gravel. I found my chance. Before I could break away, their gloved fingers reached my face for something to grab. I gladly gave my teeth and bit down. Their hands slipped, and so did they, and I spit their disgusting glove on the dirt while I broke into a dash for my front door. The screen door was open. I flung it effortlessly, threw myself inside, and slammed my heavy wooden door behind me. I stood bracing it, listening to everything, but straining to filter away my heartbeat, mind racing from adrenaline. Time stood still, but eventually, I felt myself come back down. The feeling that I was being watched was gone. Cautiously, I cracked open my front door a hair and saw that I was alone. I shut it again and called the police. When they arrived, they took my statement and asked me to show where it happened. So I did, and we saw a knife, a right-handed gray and blue glove, a crab claw, and where there were once footprints in the dirt, muddy tracks leading back down the road towards the lake. They didn't quite know what to make of it, and neither did I. That was until a week later. Someone was reported missing in our town, an ex-con who had a long list of burglaries and assault. On a hunch, the police decided to drag the deep part of the lake, the same place where people disappeared decades ago, and that's where they found him, drowned, cold, wearing a gray and blue glove on his left hand, and partially eaten. In a statement, his family mentioned that he had a phobia of the water. Despite this, no foul play was suspected, and his case, and mine, were closed. Years later, I'm still shaken up by it. I find it incredibly relaxing, however, to sit by the water. Sometimes I bring whatever dinner I couldn't finish and leave it on a plate on the lakeside. When I come back in the morning, the food is gone but the plate remains. Most of the time it's clean, but every so often, a single blue crab claw is left behind.
I was only 6 to 7 when this happened, but I remember everything. My mom had gone to work, so I stayed at home with my dad and little brother. My brother was playing with toys in the toy room while my dad and I were taking turns playing plug-and-play controllers. You will likely know what this is if you grew up in the early 2000s. Anyways, my dad had fallen asleep, so I ended up playing by myself. I was playing Mappy, a game about a mouse collecting artifacts and avoiding cats. I was pretty far into it, but my brother came up to me and wouldn't stop bothering me about something cool that he saw, and he wanted me to see it badly. I lost focus and ended up losing, so I said, "Fine, show me this stupid cool thing already," in the most annoyed tone a kid could give. Now, the one thing I left out about the toy room is that my dad had taken the door off and spun it around so that he could lock us in when we were bad. It was a pretty creepy room, mostly because it felt so empty and the light in the room was dim. My brother took me in the room and closed the door. I expected him to show me what he planned, but instead, he just turned around and smiled. I yelled at him over and over to show it to me, but he just kept smiling, and then eventually, the smile turned into a creepy laugh. I got tired of it and tried to leave the room to get back to my games, but it turns out my little brother locked the door. I yelled at him once more, but more aggressive this time. He just kept laughing. I started pounding on the door to wake my dad up. Then, I noticed my little brother had gone quiet. I turned around. He was now sitting on the toy slide we had in there. It was a small slide for babies, but he had a much more serious face. I actually got scared at that sight. He'd never made a face like that before. Then he looked up, and I did as well. He was looking at the vent on the ceiling. Then, I noticed something slowly starting to poke out. It was white, like paper white, and it was all wrinkly and veiny. If I had to describe it better, I'd say it looked like the forehead of a bald old man, slowly poking out, but the skin was just too white to be human. My eyes started to water and my brother began laughing again, louder than before. I started pounding on the door rapidly and screaming as loud as I could for my dad. I didn't dare look back again, but I heard it. I knew it wasn't human from the horrible sounds I had been making. My brother stopped laughing at that moment. But after that moment of me just pounding and nothing else, my brother let out a scream louder than I had ever heard. Like he was getting tortured. I still couldn't look back though. I was too scared. My crying and begging for the door to open just became louder. My dad then finally opened the door and I burst out. Only then did I look into the room, but there wasn't anything there, just my little brother crying and holding his leg. My dad went to check it out and he had a large deep cut on the side of his leg. I told my dad what happened, but he just gave me a hit in the back of the head for trying to lie, and my little brother, I could have sworn, had smiled at me again. But I didn't look too well if I'm honest. I grew up starting to think it was just a nightmare, like I've been told every time I speak of this memory. And maybe it was, but my brother still has a scar on where I remember he had gotten cut, but I don't know if I believe it anymore.
So, this is the first time I've ever shared a story with any of the narrators I listen to at night for my bedtime stories. This story is 100% true, and it takes place in Cincinnati, Ohio, specifically Claremont County. So, I'm a female. I'm 31 years young now, and this happened in 2006. So at the time I was 17 going on 18. My boyfriend, we'll call him M. My friend, we will call A, and her boyfriend, now husband, we will call N, are the ones involved in this unexplained event. So for some background first, there is this abandoned cabin in the middle of the woods, and you can only get to it by walking about a mile one way. There are abandoned cars, an ambulance, some tractors, and other random vehicles like a short school bus, and they're all covered in gunshots. There is not even a path to drive a vehicle back there. If there was, we would be walking a mile one way to get there, so we're not sure how they even got there, or how long they've been there. My boyfriend and I had gone with 2 other friends previous to our encounter, and it was creepy, but not compared to what happened when we went with A and N. So on our previous trip, we went out with friends T and J. T and myself went upstairs and had a Ouija board. We just asked some stupid questions I can't even remember. What I do remember is it spelled out Hooey, H-O-O-E-Y. We said goodbye on the board and was looking around the upstairs, which was really just an attic. We found massive kids' socks in the walls. We got startled when an alarm clock started ticking. It wouldn't stop, so I smashed it to pieces, and that was that. We walked downstairs where the boys were and made our way back outside. We found a creepy well that was covered up, and then all of a sudden, we heard that alarm clock start ticking again. But I know I had broken it, so that kinda spooked us. But nothing major. We saw an outdoor cellar. We went in, and there was a girl's child boot with a bone inside the shoe. So I was like, okay, we're done for today. Let's go. So my boyfriend and myself were telling A and N about this cabin, and what happened when T and J came with us. So we decided we were going to go later that day. So the day this encounter happened, M, N, A, and myself went to the lake, packed a cooler with food and crap, and spent probably 5 hours or so at the lake, and ate and just hung out. We left the lake, stopped at A and N's house, dropped the cooler off, which was in the trunk of the car. This is important for later in the story. After getting everything out of the trunk from our lake trip, we headed to my boyfriend's parents' house, where we parked the car and began our hour walk. We had flashlights and that was it. The walk there was very uneventful. We have to walk through 2 huge drainage tunnels to get to this cabin as well. So we make it there, and it wasn't dark out, but it seemed different this time. I'm not sure how to really explain it, but it was just different. But we did come later in the day than previously, so I was like, okay, whatever. Just like last time, when we got inside, A and myself were going upstairs. I wanted to show her the socks in the wall, and I also wanted to check on that clock I broke last visit that I heard ticking outside previously. As we start to go up the stairs, there was a big crash, like something was thrown or knocked over. A gets freaked out, and then out of nowhere, she books it outside back down to the creek yelling at M, N, and myself to come on. I go chasing after her, and she's in tears, having a full-blown panic attack saying something. Finally, I get that she saw someone looking in the window at us. We tell the guys and literally nobody is around, only the 4 of us. Since she's so distraught, we decided to go ahead and leave. So, as we're going back down the creek bed, heading back the same way we came, which is the only way there, M and N are kicking over these huge rocks. We stop and realize there are huge rocks. I'd say boulders standing right up in a line the entire way down the creek bed. They couldn't have been there not even 20 minutes prior, because we'd have noticed them as we were now. So this seriously freaked all of us out. This is not normal, and this is not natural. So we pick up the pace and start to haul ass out of there. We make it to the first drainage tunnel, and we turn on our flashlights. Literally none of them will turn on. 4 flashlights that worked perfectly fine on the way there, and now none of them will turn on. What's happening? So 30 minutes later, we're back at my boyfriend's parents' house, where A and N's car is parked. A gets in the car because at this point, she's ready to go home, and forget this event ever even happened. The rest of us are still outside the car. A suddenly gets out of the car screaming and jumping up and down and flaying around. She's covered in ants. We are like, what is going on? So we look and they're coming from the back seat from the trunk. N opens the trunk of his car, and laying in the trunk is this huge, rusty, extremely old wool sock covered in ants. Now remember what I said earlier in the story? We had been in and out of that trunk all day long, and there was nothing in the trunk when we left their house from dropping off the cooler. Now there is a wool sock covered in ants that covered their car. This was too much for any of us to even wrap our heads around. Needless to say, we never went back there, and I personally will never go back there. So it turns out the man who used to live in that cabin was named Hubert, and he was often called Huey. My boyfriend had actually been to the cabin once before I ever went, and he found these journals there. The man was an alleged criminal of sorts. His journals went into details about his urges and etc. I'm not going to go into that too much. But again, this story is 100% true, and it was honestly the one and only time I've ever encountered something like this. I will never go back to that cabin, ever. Even to this day, talking about it, and right now, I have goosebumps. I can't explain what happened that day. I have no idea what A saw that scared her so bad in the window, but I do know boulders do not stand straight up on their own in a line, and nobody could have done it so fast to scare us. Nobody could have messed with our 4 flashlights, and nobody could have put that old dirty ant-infested wool sock in A and N's car trunk. If you ever are wandering through the woods and come across a random cabin, just leave it alone. You never know who lived there, what they did, and who or what may still be there. Unfortunately, I learned that the very hard and unsettling way. Thank you for taking the time to read my story, and hopefully sharing it. If we are talking about our biggest accomplishment at a past job, I need to tell you about when I was working the register at a liquor store. I do not want to be too specific about the place for reasons that will be clear when you are done reading this, but it is in a suburb in Massachusetts. You know, one of those towns that gets a bad reputation, but is really not that sketchy once you spend some time there. It has seedy parts for sure, with people struggling to stay upright while trying to beg for money, but is more sad than scary, and ultimately, none of my business. I worked at a shitty strip mall liquor store on one of the major roads in and out of the area, so lots of nice houses but bad businesses. We shared the strip mall with a Chinese takeout place, a dollar store, a laundromat, and a Haitian bakery that was always closed by the time I showed up for work. It was not a good time in my life. Despite my best intentions, most days I would order a ton of fried stuff, like spring rolls or crab ragoons, and munch on the cold greasy food for hours while drinking Mountain Dew and ringing up customers. As a liquor store, we were nothing special. Usually 2 or 3 types of Sam Adams and Harpoon, and the rest of our options was all micro stuff. You either buy in a 40 or buy the case. Most of our money was in selling cigarettes and nips of liquor that people would likely take to work in their purse the next day. We had some arguments, some people putting in performances while in line, but no real drama. It was a predictable job in a depressing way. So I would get fixated with things. For example, we had a cardboard standee of Nicki Minaj, and it looked a little too small, but I kept wondering if it was to scale. I know she is tiny in real life, but then you see the standee and wonder, is she actually that small? Especially in heels with a couple of extra inches of cardboard between her feet and the floor. The other thing I was obsessed with was this big hole under the fence next to us. First of all, I wondered who the fence belonged to, The house next to the strip mall was a little too far away from the fence, so either they had a huge unkept yard or the strip mall owned it. Either way, there was a big hole under the fence that nobody would do anything about. I mean, the fence is mostly there for show. You could easily walk around it on either side, but that hole? I don't know. It hinted at there being something wild in the neighborhood. I don't mean like the usual skunks and coyotes you get out in the suburbs. Something larger. Also, every time it would rain, the hole would get flooded and usually had grown a little bigger by the time it was dry again. One rainy night, I heard a ton of loud animal sounds like yips. I ran outside, but there was nothing there. In between customers, I went out to investigate using the flashlight on my phone, and I could see a few tufts of fur that were not matted into the mud. And leading up to the hole under the fence was a long skinny pink cord. I really think it was a stretched out piece of intestine belonging to a rabbit or, God forbid, a cat. Of course, I did not dare touch it or really inspect it. I went back inside, but every time I would close my eyes, I could see that long pink cord and get a little grossed out. I asked my coworkers what they knew about the hole in the fence, but none of them really had paid it any mind. Out of all the things that would make our strip mall look more attractive, it was really low on the list compared to the potholes, aging neon signs, and our nasty communal dumpster. Still, in my own way, I remained fixated on it, and started taking more breaks outside just texting and staring at the hole. Weird shit would happen every time it would rain. For example, there was some roadkill nobody would remove, and one rainy night, it was suddenly gone between two of my breaks, as if dragged off by some unseen scavenger. As August dragged into September, we had more rainy nights, and more often I would hear yelps, whines, and other sounds of animals in distress outside. A few times I ran out leaving the customer at the register, and apologized when I came back not having seen anything. "I'm so sorry, I really think we have a coyote in our neighborhood," I would tell them, and they would tell me a coyote story of their own, but I seemed to be the only one aware that something was wrong, like how almost every post now had at least one flyer for missing pets. I decided to show up early for work one day, while it was still daylight. I got myself a couple of patties from the bakery, and at the dollar store I got a dew, and a small metal spade for potted plants. After my snack, I dug around a little in the hole, not exactly sure what I was doing. I would have to bring in a bag of sand and rocks if I really wanted to fill the hole, but scraping around, I kept hitting what looked like chicken bones, and even a strip of nylon. It did not confirm anything, but it made me more uneasy. I also realized I lacked the will to really dig, and resigned myself to wanting to quit my job and leave this as somebody else's problem. I put in my 2 weeks notice the same night we found a mangled and abandoned baby carriage next to the hole. My manager threw it into the dumpster and complained about people tossing things on the side of the road. And I mean, obviously he was right. Had a baby disappeared, it would be all over the news. But what if something dragged off a carriage hoping there would be a baby in it? Would a missing carriage even warrant a police report? On one of my last nights, it was really stormy and cold, so nobody was showing up. Everyone else kept asking me if I wanted to go home since it was dead, but instead, I would tell them, "You leave, I got it covered." It was dumb. I lived the furthest away, but I was committed to satisfying my morbid curiosity before my last day of work. Around 10:30, I heard a large thump and looked outside. There was a huge furry thing inching its way towards the hole. My blood was pumping like crazy. I was pretty sure it was a bear cub, or maybe a large dog. I turned on my phone's flashlight and went outside without an umbrella. Just with my coat pulled over my head like a hood, the thing kept inching its way towards the hole, completely ignoring my presence. I kept my distance, but I moved around it trying to get a view from the side of it. Then I realized whatever the big furry thing was, it was not alive. It was being dragged towards the hole by something long and pitch black. It looked like a centipede, with dozens of long but thin legs that would anchor themselves in the mud and pull the dead animal forward. It was as long and thick as my leg, not counting whatever part of it was already in the hole. I tried switching to my camera to take video, but that turned off the flashlight. I struggled with the settings on my phone, unable to see what was going on with any clarity. Then I heard a horrible sound, high-pitched and loud like some piece of industrial equipment. I turned my flashlight back on and realized it had let go of its prey and was staring directly at me, making loud menacing noises. Its head was slick, with huge mandibles, and large black circular surfaces, that reflected my phone's glare like hundreds of little mirrors. I think it was its eyes. I had never seen anything like it, and I hope I never see anything like it again, but I got the message. It was telling me, "This is my prey, screw off." So I got out of there, running full speed into the liquor store. My heart was beating out of my chest, and everything felt incredibly quiet, except for the howl of the wind. I kept expecting it to crash through the glass front of the store, but instead, I heard a little splash. I found an angle where I was still indoors, but I could see the hole, and the large furry thing was gone, having been dragged into it. I closed up early like everyone had told me to, and drove home with my hands shaking the entire way. On my last day, I worked up the nerve to inspect the hole again, and it was just dry cracked earth, about 2 feet wide and over a foot deep. A skinny person could probably crawl under the fence if they had to. I did math in my head while taking measurements. I showed up again a few weeks later with 2 buckets of wet cement, grateful that they did not tip over and spill during my drive. It had not rained for a week, and it did not seem like it was going to rain anytime soon. It was that last hurrah of hot days we got sometimes in October, punishing anyone foolish enough to take out their window AC units. I poured the cement into the hole until it started to overflow a little. I'm sure nobody even noticed, or if they did, they assumed whoever owns the strip mall filled in the hole. Every once in a while, I'll go back to the strip mall to buy a beer and maybe get some Chinese food. If the manager is there, we will gossip about customers and people who used to work there back when I did. I might nod at the Nicki Minaj standee, which is quickly becoming the employee with the most seniority here, but after putting everything in my car, I will go do what I really came for, to inspect that rushed patch job I performed on the hole, and make sure it is not cracked, and no new holes have sprung up around it. If you somehow found it based on my description, I'm sure you will still wonder, is this it? But for me, it's like a small monument to the one time I went out of my way to fix something. I will put my foot in the footprint I accidentally left that night, and wonder what that damn hole was connected to, and how many holes like it are still out there. This happened to me about 4 summers ago, when I went to visit my grandparents with my dad in New Mexico. We decided it would be fun to catch up with them, and being part of a hunter family, hunting game down here is a rite of passage. My dad had picked up tags for pronghorn, peccaries, and desert bighorn. My grandparents are in a quaint cottage about 2 hours north of Santa Fe, surrounded by shrubs and about 3 trees. This was their definition of privacy. They decided to retire here, as they were both done putting up with the cold, Canadian winters they had experienced for nearly 70 years. My family had no objection. Tickets weren't that expensive, and I always welcomed the heat of the Rocky Desert. This was my first time going hunting with my dad here, and it would also be my last. I wish we never decided on staying out past sunset on our 3rd night there. I don't think my dad would go out hunting at night anymore either, and he's been doing this for 20 some odd years. My dad and I scaled through the Rocky Desert with our bows and other hunting essentials for the climate. The sun was getting low, almost completely out of the horizon. Dad had gotten a few peccaries already, and carrying them around was taxing on my young body at the time. I complained about it often, but I was always met with the same stoic response. We're hunters. This is part of what we do. I noticed a tall shrub beginning to violently shake as we took a breather about a quarter mile from my grandparents' place. It was the final stretch. My dad and I both got our bows ready. Normally, the predators around here are insects and arachnids around this part, but we were prepared for a cougar to leap out of the bush. It wasn't, and the appearance of this animal was most unusual. A very large peccary, with an abnormal amount of hair missing, and a strangely small face, charged from the bush away from us. My dad grunted, putting his bow down, but I got spooked and let go. I stuck the damn thing in the back leg with an arrow. The noise it made wasn't anything I heard an animal make before. It almost sounded like a human chuckle. While my dad lectured and scolded me on shooting a fleeing animal, I saw it turn around and stare at me. Something about its gaze made me uncomfortable. It had seemingly human-like eyes. It still chills me a bit. I was ready to track it down and finish it off, as wounding an animal like that and leaving it seemed wrong. No matter how strange the situation was, I wasn't going to abandon hunting ethics. The sun fell below the horizon, and now the moon was our guide. The animal's trail wasn't too difficult to track. A goopy trail of blood is easy to follow. Eventually, we reached a stream. That's when my dad and I heard multiple animals grunting. My dad took cover behind a rock, and I followed suit, getting my bow ready. My dad peeked out and gave me a direction to look. Right along the water's edge, a group of pronghorn were pawing at something on the ground that I couldn't make out. They were real tall and skinny too. I was confused. I thought they were nocturnal. We're after your boar, so these are off limits, my dad told me, as he shuffled through his gear. However, did you know these pronghorn are highly curious animals? They might try playing with something like this. He pulled a flare out, ignited it, and tossed it perfectly at what the antelopes were pawing at. My dad kept watch, and his look went from fascination to distraught and scared quickly. Something I had never seen before with the bold man. I foolishly wanted to find out what was freaking him out, as he tried keeping low and backing away, and I regret finding out. I peeked over the rock and saw one of the pronghorns lifting the flare up with what seemed to be a human hand. Upon closer inspection, the whole group of them had human hands instead of hooves. As the thing looked at the flare in its hand, I could see all their mouths were caked in blood and guts, and the light of the flare shone what they were pawing at, a very much eaten horse carcass. Almost nothing of it remained but its head and mane. It had seemed to have been dead for a while, since we heard nothing during our whole trip. I decided enough was enough when the group of them started chuckling loudly, like the Peccary did before. To make matters worse, I saw my arrow in the hind leg of one of the pronghorn monsters as it kicked its legs around. My dad gestured for us to run and I made no hesitation to run with him. I never looked back, but during our sprint home, we kept hearing, "We're hunters. This is part of what we do," in a strangely inhuman voice echo from the desert behind us a fair distance away. We made it inside, immediately locked the doors, and shut and locked all the windows, till we couldn't see outside. We were out of breath. Unfortunately, we woke up our grandparents, which both my dad and I did our best to explain what we saw. They were understanding, and assured us that things out there wouldn't follow us far. I made myself a nice tea to calm myself down, but my father and I hardly slept a wink that night. He's more hard of hearing than I am, so I don't think he heard the creature's crude and terrifying imitations of my complaining during the hunting trip in the distance. I'm thinking it could be a skinwalker, as I hear they're a common sight around the Navajo region, which is maybe an hour away from where my grandparents live. My grandparents say, and still do to this day, that they hear laughing and footsteps on their property a few times a year at night. I worry for their safety, but I'll keep mine in check by never hunting there again.